Welcome, everyone. I'm excited for today's webinar, which lies at the intersection of immigration and education, which is an intersection where my work is often located. I am Eric Macias. I'm faculty in the School of Education at American University, and I'll be moderating today's conversation with our amazing panelists, Celina Moreno, Karina Ayala-Bermejo, and Dr. Ernesto Castañeda. Before moving into the important conversation, I'd like to state that the School of Education wants to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. is the traditional territory of the Anacostan and Piscataway people. At American University School of Education, we acknowledge this legacy and find inspiration from this land. Our land acknowledgement is a way of recognizing Indigenous presence in our everyday life. As a school, we, the SOE faculty, staff, and students have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism and our history as a nation, as a community, and as a school of education. Throughout our programs, curricula, we note the privileges we enjoy today as a result of colonialism, and we strive to not perpetuate colonial futurity. I hope our conversation today helps us pave the way beyond symbolic statements of inclusion and encourages us to act in solidarity with historically marginalized people. Let me talk a little bit about, a little bit broader, what this conversation will be engaging in. Immigration has been a hot topic this week as a result of the bipartisan agreement on border and immigration concerns. For those of us that may be a little distant from the contentious politics around immigration, the deal heavily focuses on border-specific tensions, the asylum process and systems, undocumented migration, and foreign aid for some odd reason. However, many of us, from lived experiences, research, or advocacy efforts, know that immigration concerns go beyond with what's been talked about this week with the immigration deal, or what it is about. We know that immigration has a broad definition with a wide array of processes that go beyond crossing an imaginary line. I guess it's a more militarized right now. And it seeps into the everyday aspects of our lives and our loved ones and other close friends' lives. Education is no safe haven from the spillover effect of immigration policies. Research shows that immigrant youth face academic outcome challenges due to absenteeism, language barriers, and other social cultural factors experienced in school. We also know that immigrant youth are impacted severely by the school climate. That is, many immigrant youth do not experience school as a safe space due to peer bullying, criminalization, and other zero-tolerance policies that take place. There's also less parent involvement due to fear of ICE being near schools and targeting immigrants, and because of work-related needs that we need to accomplish. Overall, these experiences lower or impact academic outcomes as well as the social, emotional, and mental wellness of immigrant youth and families. But obviously, school is not necessarily the place where these issues begin. To expand on the topic and to share with us some of their experiences on the ground and in different localities around the country, we have three amazing panelists with us today. I'm excited to engage with all of them on this important topic. We have today Dr. Ernesto Castañeda. Dr. Ernesto Castañeda is a sociologist by training and the director of both the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies and the Immigration Lab at American University. We also have Celina Moreno with us. Celina is the president and CEO of IDRA out of San Antonio, Texas. And we also have Karina Ayala-Bermejo, who is the president and CEO of the Instituto del Progreso Latino out of Chicago. Thank you all for being here. There will be a link shared about the panelists' works and bios, as well as the organizations and centers that each of them lead, and some of the work that they have engaged with. So let us dive a little bit. Let me start by asking Ernesto to expand on the immigration crisis, quote unquote, that is yet again coming up on an election year. But immigration issues aren't new, and they're rooted in bigger historical, transnational, and economic related and political issues. Ernesto, can you help us contextualize, I guess, briefly, some of the causes on why there's an increase in migration and why it is perceived as a crisis here in the U.S.?
Sure, Eric. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure for me to be with such a distinguished panel. And thank you so much to Jason Pierre and Bonnie for helping with the logistics, and to Dean Hobson for the invitation. So answering Eric's question, it's an important one to get started. So as we knew, migration is not something new into the United States, right? Half jokingly, the only great replacement that we can actually talk about is when Europeans arrived to the Americas and did change the demographic population very abruptly and very violently. And kind of the land acknowledgement reminds us of that. But since then, there's been a gradual succession of people from the Netherlands in New Holland, which becomes New York, the Puritans, etc. So it's always been a country of immigrants. That's not a cliche. It's something that is true. Didn't become accepted until Kennedy wrote that book with that name. America, the US, has been really good at making out of foreigners US Americans. But talking more recently about right now, the focus in the media, as Eric was saying, is at the US-Mexico border. And that migration is not new. It starts around the time of the World War I, the Great Depression, and after the end of the Chinese migration with the Chinese Exclusion Act, when American, particularly agricultural sectors and interests, employers, go to Mexico begging people to come here, hooking them, and giving them de facto guest worker programs. And then we have the Bracero program. So that is what really initiates formally and informally the migration from Latin Americans into the US, particularly from Mexico. A lot of the other migration that happens later in the 80s from Central America and other countries in the Caribbean and Latin America has to do a lot with foreign interventions and issues where the US had an indirect hand in that. And there's some goods that document that very well. But I'm going to focus right now in the change at the US migration, at the US-Mexico border. Once the Bracero program ends, the networks were in place already, so a lot of people could migrate without having to have a visa or a guest worker program. They could just continue the networks, the contacts, and they could get a job very easily in the fields of California and Chicago and other places, particularly agricultural and industrial labor, in the case of Mexicans. So that is when the idea of the undocumented migrant starts to become part of popular culture. In the 80s and the 90s, we have the idea of the wetbacks and this kind of to equate being Latino with being Mexican with being undocumented. That's something that has been with us for many decades. So people are used to having that connection. That it's partly true and partly false because they've been Mexicans, so people from Mexican, Latin American origin in Texas, in New Mexico, etc., since before they were part of the United States. But what I want to say is that for some decades, until the Great Recession of 2008, there were Mexicans and other Latinos and Asians and others passing undetected, trying to pass undetected through the border to come and work here under the table because there was very few ways for so-called low-skilled migrants to find a way to work here legally, but the demand has always been here, and immigrants are employed almost as soon as they arrive, working age migrants. So traditionally not able to bring their families. So as we discuss in this book that is forthcoming, immigration laws as we have them in the US and Europe create family separation way before the policy that Trump put into place. So that's an issue. So we see, for example, in 2014, one of the recent migrant crises when Obama was in the White House about Central American kids coming unaccompanied. And they were coming to the DMV, for example, because their parents had been living here for decades. So again, that, if you understand it as a family, as a process, is something that shouldn't have surprised anybody. But there was a big crisis at the border right there. Why are these kids coming? How are we going to handle them? Where are we going to house them? And we figured it out. And now most of them reunited with their families in the US. Then we had the issue of Haitians under the bridge. There was a regularization that happened, and then we don't see as many Haitians accumulating in the border. Then we had a big influx from people from Afghanistan, and there was an issue in the Washington area that the hotels couldn't house them anymore, that the US couldn't afford to give them housing and jobs, and now they are part of our economy, etc. So we've been here before, but the journalists sometimes don't have space in their stories to remind us about the different waves and the different way they have covered this before, talking about different populations. So it brings us to today, where we have indeed a larger number of people that are visible to the media. And I think it's very dangerous to say that these are historical records for a number of reasons. First of all, and again, I can talk about more in details in the Q&A if there's time. But after the end of the pandemic and the end of Title 42, the Border Patrol starts counting encounters, which means a border official or an immigration official encountering an immigrant. Sorry, encounters does not equal individuals. So a lot of people are encountered many times, sent back to Mexico, they get encountered again, they get counted again. So those numbers are inflated by definition. And then one of the conservative senator who was negotiating this deal that Eric was talking about in the Senate, he was speaking yesterday in Congress and had this chart of the apprehensions going up. But what happened before the pandemic, the Border Patrol counted apprehensions. That was the way that people think. So just doing a historical graph looking at encounters is just methodologically, mathematically false. We're comparing apples and oranges. The way the Border Patrol people count, the way Border Patrol counts things at the border has changed. So that's a manufactured crisis that the Border Patrol has done on its own interest to ask for more resources, more personnel that they need. But it's a way to use the numbers in their favor. As we know, statistics can lie sometimes. All right. Another thing that's very important for the audience to keep in mind, and the public here, is that as I was saying, the law for a long time kind of incentivized this coming under the table because that was one way to make a living. With the further militarization of the border, with Trump coming into office, the reinforcement of the border walls, et cetera, it's a little bit harder to do that, more costly. You get more organized crime behind this because that's what these policies create. But more importantly, there was a shift, and Mexico is getting older and aging. So there's less people coming from Mexico. Net migration from Mexico is almost zero. There's individuals, but overall, more people leave than the ones that come back. If we look at the documented population in the US for the last 20 years, it's around 10 million, 11, 12, but it hasn't grown more than that. Why? Because some people leave, are deported, or become citizens. So again, we're not a crisis in terms of the undocumented population ballooning. They need rights, and there's an issue that we have to fix, but it's not a growing number. Something else that has changed that is very important is that now people are indeed coming from Central America, war-torn countries that the US accepts there's issues happening, like Haiti, economic crisis in Cuba, Venezuela, and they are asking for asylum. So they are turning themselves in on purpose. Say, Border Patrol, here I am. I'm not trying to hide, I'm not trying to pass through the night. Many people are actively arriving to the border and asking for asylum. So it's easy to be counted, and it's easier for the cameras to be there and film and say, oh, wow, there's all these people in line to enter. But it's as ridiculous, but it is not illegal. They are coming, turning themselves in, getting fingerprinted, giving people addresses where they're going to be, asking for asylum. That is legal under the US law and international law. So to say, as many people in the media say, that they're illegal crossings is just technically and legally wrong. But that trope of previous understandings of people walking in the border without a visa and saying that that's illegal is factually incorrect for many of those encounters. So that's why this crisis is in a way manufactured. A couple more things too, and then I'll finish. So asking for asylum is something that is allowed, and these lines are coming in because we don't have enough people to process asylum seekers. That is true. That's something that was in this bill. That was one of the few positive things. But it's as ridiculous having camera crews, having footage of these people at the border in Eagle Pass, El Paso, etc. It's as ridiculous as having cameras always in the line at JFK or the local airport in Washington, or any airport, just saying, wow, look at the immigration lines, they are so long. Well, yeah, they're waiting to be processed, right? So it's the same thing in the images that we see. It's not a real crisis. People are not invading. They are not coming with weapons. They are not, immigrants for the most part are not carrying fentanyl or any other drugs. Those drugs are passing through the huge trade that happens between the US and Mexico every day, the #1 trading partner of the US in Mexico. So a lot of that trade is happening through the border. And again, then Mexico plays a role in the international relation and how migration gets politicized in the US, in Mexico, and as part of that relationship. But so what we're saying is not new. The fact that we're saying new is that the importance of Mexican migration has decreased, and there are other groups that are feeling that labor demand. What is different is that rather than people passing through the night trying to pass undetected, now people want to be detected for the most part. And if you're Venezuelan, Cuban, Haitian, there's programs for you to become legal. That's a good policy innovation of Mallorca's. And Biden, that is also legal, the Parole Authority, and expanding that. So that's new, but again, it's not, Mallorca's is not breaking the law on purpose. It's something that is in the discretion of them to do. And then what we see then is people arriving to New York City, to Chicago, and all that, to connect it to the next question, which is before people will arrive and stay with a cousin, don't ask for any resources and everything. But now asylum seekers, because they're closer legally to a refugee, the state knows that they are here. And the cities have now immigration offices that were not the case before, that they're welcoming these immigrants and giving them temporary housing and food. We're seeing that there's a budget, and then cities like New York, Denver are complaining about this expenditure. But it's an investment like we do for many years with refugees that they're going to pay back to the city once they get jobs and pay. And that's something that we read in the report. While this migration was happening, New York wouldn't exist without migrants, including undocumented ones. They have always been part of the fabric of the city, but they were in the shadows. They were hidden. The new asylum seekers are more visible, which is good because then we can help them better, but then they are politicized by the media and by some politicians. That's what's new, but not the numbers, not the dynamics. And we need this migration in order to keep our economy and population growing. Otherwise, the American population will decrease, and so will the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Yeah, I guess just to summarize that point, there isn't necessarily an immigration crisis, but rather a crisis of inclusive policies, that will support immigration in a better way, and then a media heightened kind of crisis, right? That obviously have implications on the ground, in real life, right? Beyond those policies, or how media perceives the whole issue. And I want to go to Selena, being closer to the border. I wanted to, ask you, Selena, that we have read so much about the border, right? And obviously it's one of the huge tensions between this bill. Can you share with us here today, like what you've observed on the ground, and what are the implications of the bill, on the community there as you see it?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is Selena Moreno. I'm the president and CEO of IDRA. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to education justice for all young people. And we were founded 51 years ago in Texas and work nationally to train educators, conduct research, build coalitions to advocate before Congress and state legislatures, and develop student and family leadership. Previously, I directed litigation and policy for the Southwest office of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And through those roles, I've worked in the intersection between immigrants and students' rights. And I'm so honored to be here with you today at the invitation of Dean Hobson to talk about both of those things. So I'll start, Eric, with the broader look at the anti-immigrant state action in Texas. What's happening on the southern border and beyond is that right now conservatives are codifying into law the anti-immigrant proposals that have been attempted for years, but have not succeeded because of real constitutional concerns. So what I'll talk about is all tied to this movement that's been going on for decades, but conservatives see their moment. They see the chance to roll back rights that have long been found to be protected by the US Constitution. We've already seen, right, generally more, the reversal of rights in the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, in the recent Supreme Court decision to gut affirmative action in higher education. And the issues we're going to discuss are part of case law that are on a path to the US Supreme Court. And if those conservative groups are successful, the consequences are going to be devastating, not just for immigrant families and immigrant students either. So what's going on the border? There's a lot happening at the border, especially in Texas, which has a over 1,200-mile border with Mexico. Too much really for one panel, but I'm going to touch on three policies at issue today. First, Operation Lone Star. Secondly, the draconian Senate Bill 4 passed last year. And third, DACA, which is temporary relief from deportation for qualifying dreamers. So first, Operation Lone Star is one key point of tension between Governor Greg Abbott from Texas and established constitutional precedent. Over the last several years, Governor Abbott has escalated this multi-billion-dollar program of Operation Lone Star, which is a state-level border enforcement deploying thousands of Texas National Guard troops and state police to indefinitely patrol the border. So, for example, making arrests for violating state trespassing laws on private land along the border, right? Trying to get around federal immigration law. Governor Abbott has established state control over areas near the Rio Grande River, which separates the United States and Texas, in an effort to deter migrants. So, for example, you mentioned Eagle Pass. He has ordered placement of razor wire fencing and buoys along the border, and there are multiple reports that people have drowned and been seriously injured as a result. Governor Abbott also uses this rhetoric of invasion, including his recent statement that the only thing we're not doing is we're not shooting people who come across the border because, of course, the Biden administration would charge us with murder. That's an actual quote. And this rhetoric can really have deadly consequences. So we all remember in 2019, when a man drove 6 hours to El Paso, Texas, and committed mass murder, and he posted, "This attack is a response of the Hispanic invasion of Texas." So this is suffering that's occurring right here in our country. And the state of Texas is not just complicit, it has outright sanctioned, legalized, and funded this type of inhumane policy that, again, has long been pushed for, but now is becoming a reality. The second thing is Senate Bill 4. So during the last legislative session in 2023, Texas passed this really draconian law called SB 4. It is the most extreme anti-immigrant bill in the country that creates a Texas deportation force, and it allows individuals to be detained and arrested based solely on suspicion of being in the country without legal authorization. It also requires state judges to issue an immigration-like removal order upon conviction. So that's even for people who are seeking asylum and with pending cases before immigration courts. And you're right that this is more than a border issue. So as part of SB 4, for example, local or state police officers, such as sheriffs or local police in cities, can make arrests all over the state of Texas, even up to 2 years after the alleged trespassing offense. So how are officers far from the border going to decide whether someone crossed illegally without asking for immigration documents? And what SB 4 does is legalize racial profiling that has occurred for years to both non-citizens and also US citizens. It continues to sow distrust between law enforcement and the community, and that has really devastating consequences on immigrants reporting crime when they're victims of crime. In addition, Governor Abbott has bused and flown hundreds of thousands of migrants to Democratic-run cities, Chicago, LA, DC, New York. And I think it's not a coincidence that these cities are also run by African-American mayors. I think it's a cynical attempt by the governor to pit communities against each other, but we are not fools. Lastly, I just want to say that the lawsuit to determine the legality of DACA is currently before the Fifth Circuit. And so meanwhile, the futures of Dreamers hang in the balance.
Thank you, Selena. That's a lot to unpack there. And obviously, these issues aren't necessarily experienced just at the border, as many scholars and advocates have understood. There's a spillover, and it goes into every city, every aspect of our life. So I want to ask Karina to tell us and share with us a little bit what she's seeing on the ground in Chicago. There's been a lot of emphasis on housing and shelters being at capacity or beyond capacity. And yeah, how do you see this issue evolving? Yeah, how is the crisis of shelters and housing, specifically with immigrants, impacting Chicago?
Thank you, Eric, for that question, and thank you for the honor and privilege of being with you on this panel. My name is Karina Ayala-Bermejo. I have the honor of serving as CEO and president of Instituto de Progreso Latino. Our mission is to ensure that Latino immigrants reach their fullest potential, and we do that through education, training, employment, and legal services. For 46 years, we're embedded as a beacon of hope in Chicago, and our outreach efforts extend statewide since we are the largest submitter of citizenship applications in the state of Illinois. There's so much, Ernesto and Selena, that you said that I want to just jump right into that is so connected to why Chicago is witnessing what or experiencing and living through what we have. And it is obviously a direct attack on Chicago, our African-American mayor, our state, because since 1985, we've been a welcoming city, right? This is nothing new. And I think the conflation or the confusion around what that means, right? Back in 85, we decided that we were not going to be asking or inquiring about your immigration status, and that our police is not going to be participating with the federal government. And that's been a longstanding right. Illinois has been a long time place, safe haven for many immigrants. Mexican largest population, Polish largest population outside of Warsaw. So this is one that's really important to us. And what we're seeing now is a Governor Abbott man-made crisis of chaotic sending of individuals in buses, these rogue buses that are arriving, no longer abiding by the rules that were set on landing on the landing zone. They are being dropped off outside of the city limits in dangerous situations where they're being then bused back to Chicago, creating this chaos unnecessarily and endangering the lives of individuals. We have received about 30,000 immigrants, and Chicago has done the best that they can given this chaotic situation. I do want to say that. And today, for the first time, O'Hare Airport does not have the tent city that it had. And that was a recent update. What we do have is a situation where, as you mentioned, Eric, our shelters are full. So that the mayor has started a 60-day limit on shelters, much like New York has. And because of the inclement weather, right, we knew that this was going to be a problem. Those deadlines have been extended so that we are going to have a very large number, 6,000, about 6,000 individuals who will be exiting shelter in approximately 2 weeks. Restate that, about 3 weeks. And that is a crisis in that either they're going to return back to the front line and join those awaiting placement in the shelters, or they're going to be homeless and joining the unhoused population. So that, as you know, creates tension with our existing unhoused population and pits Black and brown communities against each other. That's what you're seeing. Early on, there was a tent city outside of most police districts, right? We Instituto are in close proximity proximity to the 12th District Police Station. That's probably the one you saw all over the news, where you had tent cities everywhere and you had individuals who were sleeping on the floor of police stations. Because of the focused effort on ensuring that those were de-escalated and moved into shelters, we no longer have that because they would have froze to death, right? We had that negative 30-degree weather and folks were then placed in large-scaled shelters. We are in a situation that we are going to have a revolving door if we don't figure out the long-term strategy of housing. Ernesto, you mentioned early on about why this is happening, right? We're seeing Haitians, Venezuelans, and Cubans, just like you mentioned. And when I was a undocumented kid, I came from Mexico. My parents were migrant farm workers from Salinas, California, but my brother was born in California, right? So those laws allowed the ability for me and my family to adjust our status, to become U.S. citizens, for me to go to law school and be at the head of this really important issue. Those laws don't exist anymore. The ability for someone to come in from Venezuela, Haiti, they don't know anyone, just like you're saying. They are raising their hand and saying, I am applying for asylum. And that is their absolute right, decades old in domestic and international laws, and that is being denied. So what we're seeing in Chicago is much like what we're seeing in other cities and states that are saying we will continue to be a sanctuary place, right? It is no accident that the focus in Chicago is because we're going to have the Democratic National Convention soon, and that we have to really expedite the temporary protective status work authorizations, which is what Instituto and some other organizations are doing, so that we can have people on a path to self-sufficiency and employment. So all of these pieces are moving so rapidly at the same time, and we can't keep up with the speed at which we need to be moving. And I can go on forever, but it really is a unnecessary man-made created crisis where if there had been communication, of course, we would have had better coordination and not put individual lives at risk or treated them like chattel the way they were sent.
Thank you all for sharing those specifics. But obviously, right, these policies and these are all interwoven issues, right? We're not just talking about specific things that are happening at the border or, shelters and housing issues impacting immigrant population in Chicago and New York and other places, right? So I want to ask you all one at a time, but this kind of the same question of how are the communities in which you're in? I know, Ernesto, you're in the DC area and Chicago and Texas. How educationally, how immigrant youth are impacted by some of these immigration policies, as they have kind of a spillover effect into every day.
Right, so let me get started and to continue against the same order. Very important question, Eric. So the U.S. doesn't really have an immigrant integration policy and programs. And for the most part, we have not provided new arriving immigrants with housing, with food, with training, with language lessons. This is grassroots efforts from communities on the ground, from nonprofits like the ones here represented and others that do an Herculean work and are key in helping a lot of individuals. But there's too many immigrants to serve everybody. There's not enough resources for everybody. And again, it's not the fault of the nonprofits and the civil society. There is not enough effort that the federal or the local governments put into this and the resources. So what we see in Chicago, New York, is that there's not enough resources for the homeless, the US born. That's been an issue for a long time that I also have been studying. And there's not a system set up for asylum seekers or immigrants. Except for shelters that have been nonprofits that have always had a very tough budget situation. Even the grants have been drying out. So there's no many resources. So I would argue, and I argue in this forthcoming book about Central American youth in the DMV, that in the U.S. case, in cities, which is where a lot of the immigration comes to, not the only, but in cities, integration happens mainly in two places. In the workplace for adults, they meet other Americans, they learn about the American way of life. Immigrants dealing with their patrones, with their bosses, and with other workers from other ethnicities, and with customers, depending on what field they are in. And that's kind of how they learn to be American, and they do a great job, and they do. And now for kids that come, the main socialization for any kid, but particularly for immigrant kids, the immigrant integration mechanism par excellence is the school. The school systems are for immigrants, kids, have to learn English really quickly, sometimes with supports from, that's why the School of Education, I'm glad is doing this, because there's a lot that schools can do to help better immigrants from all over the world that most often come without good knowledge of English and cannot take classes in that language. And then there's programs, as you guys know, for English language learners, and there's a whole literature on pros and cons about that. But that needs resources, and it needs the acceptance and the realization from schools systems around the country that there's these populations arriving. So that's the first thing. So the DMV, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Maryland, increasingly since this companion crisis that I was talking about in 2014, before with other Bolivians and other groups, the school APS, the school systems are aware of the immigrant population that they have. That is being crucial for schools to grow and stay open to hire more teachers. Otherwise, we'll have an aging of the population locally too. So there's an awareness, and depending on each school and each school system, there's more resources and programs that work and not. So that's why this discussion is very important, because educators have to be aware of this and do something about it. And it's also about citizens asking for the adequate resources, because it's an investment in our youth. It's a cliche, but students and children are the future of a country. But more and more, it's children of immigrants for the US and Latinos in particular. 25% of children in America are Latinos, and many of them are immigrant. Half of them are US born, speak perfect English, but the other ones are learning the language, so they have to have some supports. So in that book, we document how Central Americans become Americans in schools, and despite some issues they face with teachers, administration, and other students, they find belonging to making friendships, to other people that speak Spanish with them, to soccer, as you know, in your own work. They find a way to be part of their communities that they're part of, with others that are going through similar experiences than them, or some others of kids of parents that went through similar experiences. So the schools do that whether they want it or not. So they can do it better or worse, depending on policies. Let me just give an example of a school in the area that had a program for immigrant mothers who had to leave their children behind because of the immigration policies we had. And they were working in the DMV, and their children were back, in this case, in Central America. So now they were getting reunited, and they're biological parents and kids, but they haven't lived together for over 10 years. So it's what me and Leslie both call families of strangers. So they have to leave. The kids are coming, adolescents, young kids, and they are meeting their biological parents for the first time, learning to live with them because they're related, but they don't know them. They used to live with a grandmother, with an aunt and uncle. It's a lot of changes in a new language, in a new neighborhood, in a new school. There's a lot of tensions, and sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding. From the kids, they feel abandoned, and that's their feeling. You're going to take it. And the parents feel misunderstood, that their sacrifice and their sending of money and all that they migrated for the family, and the kid doesn't understand that, and they cannot. So this school program after school was getting mothers of Central America together and having these collective therapy and discussions, so that the mothers knew that they were not alone in this situation. It wasn't their fault. It was not because they were bad mothers or bad fathers. It was something that the situation created, and a lot of the neighbors and a lot of kids in the school had gone through that. So just that ability to share that it wasn't unique to their own families, and that there were ways to make it better and support kids in school without knowing the language and without having the time to meet with teachers and all that. That was extremely powerful and effective. And those programs are always at risk of being cut because of budget reductions and all that. So that's an example of where schools are doing a lot and they can do better by being intentional in supporting these populations.
Thank you for sharing and for sharing that specific example to let us know what some of the communities are doing, right? That they have some sort of agency as well, right? That they're not just this immigration policies and the current, immigration bills, are imposed on them. But I'd love to hear from Selena and from Karina.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really can't stress enough the catastrophic impact that we would all see if this extreme conservative agenda of rolling back decades of progress is successful. So some of us on the call might remember a time before federal courts intervened and established these legal protections, and many of us, however, have lived in this country where we really, that's all we know, and we take them for granted because they've always been there. But I think this legalization of discrimination can have tremendous consequences for schools and students all over the country. We can see students being forced out of schools solely based on their immigration status, families torn apart, mass deportations, and one of the largest expansions of the prison industrial complex, the likes that we have not seen since after the civil rights movement. And so this is really no longer theory. This is very real. So I want to talk about, what are some of the things we can do. One, knowing our rights and educating others about our rights. Secondly, building a multiracial, multi-sector coalition, and then being prepared for what could come. And I'll just talk quickly about an example for each of those strategies. So first, knowing our rights. We have to know our history to be able to preserve hard-fought rights. Again, looking at Roe and affirmative action as examples. And a perfect example in this context is Plyler v. Doe. So Plyler, as many of you know, is a landmark 1982 Supreme Court case that ensured that all students, regardless of their immigration status, have the right to attend free public schools. IDRA played an instrumental role as expert witness in that case. And as a result of the ruling, public schools cannot deny admission to a student on the basis of undocumented status, cannot engage in any practices that chill the right of access to school. They cannot require students or parents to disclose or document their immigration status, make inquiries that would tend to expose that status. So, for example, cannot require a social security number. And in IDRA, we share a resource that we send out at the beginning of every single school year, reminding school districts, reminding community leaders and families of these immigrant students' rights. And I'm happy to share that flyer, that resource, because we still get calls every single school year, maybe somebody who is an ignorant member of a school community or is defiant, maybe registrar or attendance clerk just not knowing the law. We also try to educate our community through partnerships with the Mexican consulate. So we operate at IDRA the consulate's community education program for nationals from Mexico and other Latin American countries to ensure that they know how to navigate the U.S. education system and that they know their rights so they can be engaged in preserving them as well. And I think it's important that colleges of education ensure a really strong foundation in Plyler, which is well-settled law and now over 40 years old. There have been in Texas bills, almost every session trying to attack the Plyler rights. Our governor, Governor Greg Abbott, threatened to resurrect Plyler v. Doe a few years ago to take it back to court, saying that immigrants were invading our schools. He also publicly discussed his disdain for the Supreme Court's ruling in Plyler in August 2019, and that was just 3 weeks after the El Paso mass shooting targeting the Latino community. And so again, just there's a callousness there. And so we have to build multiracial, multi-sector coalitions. And I want to use the Texas DREAM Act as an example of how doing so has protected that important legislation. So Texas in 2001 became the first state, even before California, in the nation to pass a DREAM Act, which provides in-state tuition eligibility and state financial aid for undocumented Texans who attend and graduate from Texas high schools. In the decades since it's passed, there have been attempts in almost every legislative session to try to repeal that law. And they have been unsuccessful, thankfully, because of that coalition of not only civil rights leaders, Black and Brown, Dreamer students, and other immigrants' rights advocates, but because they have joined forces with this type of business badges Bible coalition. So leaders from the business community, leaders from law enforcement, and religious communities. I remember when I was at MALDEF, I defended against a lawsuit attempting to end the Texas DREAM Act by an anti-immigrant group. And thankfully, we were successful in getting the case dismissed. But a key lesson is that some of these anti-immigrant groups are like weeds. They just keep popping up, and they're frustrated because they keep losing in court and in the legislature. So last year, they tried a new and dirty, clever trick to go to federal court and try to get around that previous case law, and instead attacked out-of-state tuition laws in a way that indirectly tried to take down the Texas DREAM Act. And so basically the lawsuit said out-of-state tuition rates for out-of-state US citizens are illegal as long as the Texas DREAM Act is in place. And so ending out-of-state in Texas public universities would have meant a loss of tens of millions of dollars every single year in tuition for those universities. And I'm proud to announce that we have had a favorable outcome. This was last year before the Fifth Circuit, arguably the most conservative federal appellate court in the nation. And I believe that the plaintiffs lost in that case on the other side because we had a strong coalition in our legal advocacy. So we led a coalition amicus brief of business, student, and administrative voices. And so I would just say that it is possible to have wins, but that coalition building is extremely important. The other thing I'll say is that the plaintiff in this case, it was an anti-immigrant Young Conservatives of Texas group, YCT. When I was in college, starting in the late 90s, it was a very marginalized group. They had this Catch an Illegal Immigrant game. They had anti-Black and anti-Latino March 2nd, Texas Independence Day celebrations where they would, which is very real in Texas, Mexicans and Blacks would get lynched, throughout Texas history. And so they would have piñatas doing, pretending to lynch Latino and Black people. They would have affirmative action bake sales, mocking affirmative action. And so that was then. Now they are now being represented by one of the most powerful lobbies in the state of Texas, the very conservative Texas Public Policy Foundation. So again, you're seeing this very real shift in power. So we have to be prepared for what can come. Just a few years ago, Mississippi saw one of the largest ICE raids in US history that again, not only impacted immigrants working in the factories, but also their US children, other workers who fell victim to racial profiling by ICE, local business and industry that rely on their labor. And so with that increasing legalized discrimination, we could potentially see more ICE raids. And so schools have to be prepared. IDRA worked with the Mississippi School District where this happened to ensure that they were providing safe waiting spaces like a school gym where students can wait if a parent was detained during a raid, making sure that they were following federal law to protect students who became unhoused, providing counseling support, building relationships with local nonprofits, obstructing the school to deportation pipeline by needlessly having law enforcement on campus, and of course, providing training for teachers. So we really have to act preventatively to be prepared for these types of situations so we can best serve our most vulnerable students.
Thank you, Selena. I want to briefly throw it to Karina so we have enough time to address a couple of questions that have come up on the Q&A.
It's absolutely incredible, the vigilance that we must continue to keep in Chicago. A part of our Instituto's mission is that education is power. And we firmly believe that we have 2 high schools and a college of nursing. And when the housing crisis of the immigrants began, our first interactions were just witnessing the number of young people, the young number of families, and making sure that they were enrolled in education. To your point earlier, we faced barriers, especially during the summer, with registrars who probably did not understand the Plyler history and asking for documentation and just making things a big mess, so that they were needing to jump through illegal hoops to get enrolled. We worked really hard to explain and to enroll. We at Instituto have 2 high schools, so we have the honor of walking with families and know that social emotional learning, that their mental health and all of the wraparound services are so critically important at this time. And we are able to do that. I think one important note to make is that because of the increased need for individuals, educators to have EL credentials, that there has to be an increased effort in expediting the process for individuals to get that licensure, and Title I funding that really supports a lot of our Spanish speakers, dual language speakers, so that we're able to address those needs, as well as SEL increase. So you're getting a lot of increased student need, and STL, all of the usual buckets, right, are now growing in numbers, and certain districts are not equipped to handle. So it's about catching up with the credentialing and those individuals who can really make a difference and make a positive difference in the lives of those students who are now enrolled in their schools. And like I said, Instituto is privileged to have in our schools students who are really growing roots in the community, and that's really what we want. We notice that when individuals and families are near nonprofits and near schools that understand the cultural importance and understand them as assets, they really do flourish. And I'm excited to see them grow within our organization.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of add to Karina's point, and to address one of the questions, there is more need to train teachers in about these policies and how they also impact education, that is not siloed, and it's just, you know, this other aspect of life that we do need to train our teachers about Plyler. We do need to train our educators to create a safe space for young people. If not, they're complicit. They become unintentionally complicit in the process. There's a question again by Marina that I think maybe one of us can address. Why are the anti-immigrant winning the immigration debate, at least politically? How can we turn the tide? Maybe Ernesto, you could add to this.
Thank you. Sure, Eric. Great question, important question. And I agree, the Republicans have been very good with voicing their anti-immigration rhetoric, and Selena was pointing really well about the dangers of that. There's no doubt about it. And the Democrats in the past have been very willing to echo that. With Trump, it got so bad that the Democrats, it was easier for them to distance themselves from the Trump policies like family separation. So that was a great opportunity time. And again, in the elections, as elections come, we have to remind politicians that the moral thing to do is to differentiate themselves from the Trump and the Republican policies, for a number of reasons that are also in their interest. First of all, Biden and company are not gonna get the Trump vote by being very anti-immigrant. That vote is not for them. They're gonna vote for Trump for being Trump. Those people, it's gonna be very hard for them to vote for Nikki Haley. And Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis have been more anti-immigrant in the practice than Trump even was as president, and they haven't been able to flank Trump and get that base. Those votes are not competitive, but they're in the minority. The anti-immigrant group is very loud. It's on the right, but it's a minority of the U.S. population, and it's even a minority within the Republican Party. For many years, polls showed that Democrats, independents, and Republicans are in favor of the DREAM Act, are in favor of a path to citizenship. So the politicians, particularly Republicans, are more hardline and more anti-immigrant than the US population, partly because of this fear of the base. And they're very loud. So we have to make sure that the pro-immigrant voices are equally as loud, although a lot of people are tolerant of migration, but that is not their number one concern. Even a lot of immigrant families, they are concerned about rent, about housing, about education, about these important issues that are day-to-day, that they have in common with any other American. So another important thing for that the media doesn't get, because they're repeating these tropes from the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, but it will be good for Democrats to realize, and we're coming up with a paper on this that we'll publish in a couple of weeks. Being anti-immigrant doesn't win you elections. It worked really well for Bill Wilson in California for a while back. Then that organized Latinos, and now see California is a strong Democratic stronghold. In federal elections, it worked really well for Trump in 2016, but the anti-caravan, anti-Central American discourse in 2018 didn't work for him or the people running in those midterm elections. It didn't work for him in 2020, where he dialed it back a little bit on the anti-Mexican discourse. He lost. 2022, the most anti-immigrant candidates in swing states and districts, they lost. 2023, the same thing. So it's a losing political issue, although people don't realize that. But if you look at the data, it's not winning. Most people are lukewarm. And then asking somebody, what's the concern that you care most about? They may say migration in a poll, but that doesn't mean that because of that, they're going to vote for one candidate or another. And again, migration is a top issue for me, but what I mean is very different from a white nationalist, what they mean. So for the most of the population, I understand that immigrants are humans, that America has always been multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and that's a tradition and it can continue, and that's not the end of the country. The opposite is a future. There's a lot to say. So I think people on the left or people that are pro-immigrant, they have to go back and ask for the DREAM Act to pass. It's time for it to pass. For an amnesty, we shouldn't be afraid of that word anymore. We have to double down on progressive policies to mobilize the base, to say, yes, we're going to vote for X party, but we want these real policies in exchange and not to be used in exchange for money for Ukraine or for money of Israel, that the Democrats were kind of fast to do over this winter break. Luckily, Trump thinks this is going to help him electorally, but I think he's wrong. But it's good because he killed the bill, which was a very bad bill.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say, we encourage everyone to keep an eye on some of the things that are bubbling up on the courts. There's been, some of the Plyler conversation is concerning, and we encourage everyone to just advocate and keep your ear to the ground on some of these bigger issues. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you all, and I want to pass it on to Dr. Hobson.
No, thank you so much. I'm Rodney Hobson, co-acting dean and professor, and I really appreciate this incredibly informative panel, which highlighted the issues of in the intersections of education, schooling, and immigration, particularly highlighting especially the contentious politics that go beyond the border, the role of schools that are already facing pressures at poorly funded districts, Title I schools, often more particular amongst populations of ELL, English language learners, Latinx, and other immigrant students. Role of schools often under siege by virtue of US ICE policies and practices that disrupt schooling, and as well the role of safe spaces and havens in communities and cities, so eloquently shared, but also being challenged and squeezed into tents. Emergency shelters that go beyond issues of education, housing, social welfare, and so forth, as well as highlighting the manufactured crises around the illegality of migration and the perpetuation of moral panics at this moment among a divisive and wedge issues during an election year, but also in the context of challenges about our changing American demography, citizenry, and identity. And so this Big Ideas webinar is in the keeping of others that we've had that arose out of our school and need to address during Dean Cheryl Holcomb McCoy's leadership, and respond during COVID to address our changing landscape, particularly around issues of inequities and the multiple pandemics that spill over in education and schools. So please pay attention for our future Big Ideas. There's a webinar website that we have Maybe Jason, you could throw that up. Maybe you've already done that, actually, I see. Well, you'll see examples from previous webinars about most recently with resources. This year's theme, which highlights the issues around civil rights, Brown versus Board anniversaries. And so these things were highlighted tonight. But a big thank you and a special thank you, honorable thank you, especially to the panelists, Selena of IDRA, Karina of Instituto, for your informative, for your crisp explanations of this critical importance of coalition building, intersections of these issues and how they are real and current in our contemporary American society. Ernesto, Immigration Lab at AU, for your always prescient demographic, sociological analyses at national, international, and local levels. Thank you all as well, and especially to our team, Eric, Veronica, Jason, Bonnie, for your usual great work and logistical work. Thank you all participants, thank you all audience, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.